The image of the medieval knight is burned into our collective consciousness. A heroic warrior encased in gleaming steel, the embodiment of honor and courage, a symbol of an entire age. We see him in historical films, in romantic novels, in children's fairy tales. A figure mounted on a powerful war horse, ready to defend his lady or his lord with his life. This image is so familiar, so thoroughly romanticized, that it seems carved in stone, an unquestionable historical fact. But what if this beautiful picture is nothing more than a facade? What if everything we think we know about medieval knights is only the convenient version of the truth, the part that doesn't require us to ask uncomfortable questions? We need only step away from the heroic epics for a moment and examine the cold, hard facts, and the familiar world begins to crumble. Some historians, like guardians of ancient mysteries, seem to prefer ignoring the contradictions that stick out from every angle, rather than disturbing the established narrative. They're prepared to dismiss obvious technological impossibilities as beautiful but impractical, and glaring logical fallacies as mere quirks of a barbaric age. When the facts contradict the theory, it's easier to call the facts strange than to reconsider the entire theory. But what if these strange facts are the key to everything? What if the armor wasn't just protective equipment for a human warrior, but something entirely different? And this is precisely why official history has painted itself into a corner it cannot escape. Let me ask you the fundamental question that changes everything. Was there even a human being inside that armor at all? This question opens a door into a labyrinth of mysteries, where each new discovery doesn't provide answers, but creates even more profound doubts. As we dive into medieval chronicles and military documents, we encounter rules and customs that seem not just odd, but completely irrational from the perspective of human psychology and battlefield tactics. We're told about wars governed by rules so absurd they make you question whether the participants were even sane. Imagine an army that would be completely and physically annihilated if it lost a single combatant, the knight. This wasn't simply an incentive to protect your commander. This was a system where the value of one individual was immeasurably greater than thousands of other lives. This custom is extensively documented in historical records, yet no coherent explanation exists for it. Why would the fate of an entire army depend directly on one soldier, as if he were not merely a leader, but something like a beating heart whose stopping would cause the entire organism to die? This bizarre value system, where one figure is worth more than thousands, is reflected in even stranger combat regulations. Picture this scenario. A common foot soldier finds himself near an enemy knight during battle. Perhaps he could deliver a decisive blow or assist his own commander. But no. Any physical contact between a common soldier and a knight was punishable by immediate execution. It didn't matter whether the soldier's intentions were hostile or helpful. Only another knight could capture a knight. This rule seems like the pinnacle of aristocratic snobbery until you consider its deeper implications. Historians explain it as an effort to preserve valuable prisoners for ransom, but this logic collapses under scrutiny. In real combat, where the survival of entire armies hangs in the balance, no one would risk defeat to observe such delicate etiquette. A valuable prisoner would be secured by any means necessary, by any forces available. However, if we assume a knight was not simply a man wearing armor, but something else entirely, then this rule that only a knight may touch a knight takes on sinister yet logical meaning. It becomes not a matter of honor, but a technical protocol. As if only the operator of a similar system knew how to correctly interact with the opposing unit, how to disable or control it without causing irreversible damage or triggering some kind of defensive reaction. This transforms combat from a battle between two warriors into a confrontation between two systems, where interference from an unauthorized element was prohibited and perhaps dangerous for everyone involved. The picture of complete absurdity is completed by accounts of engagements that can barely be called battles at all. Chronicles describe conflicts where knights fought in single combat that lasted for days, while their armies of thousands simply stood by and watched. They didn't join the fight, didn't attempt to assist their leader, didn't execute any tactical maneuvers. They were spectators at this theater of war, where only the main actors in iron masks performed on stage. And when one knight finally admitted defeat, something astonishing happened. His army wasn't scattered or destroyed. Instead, it transferred allegiance to the victor. And critically, this happened with the consent of the defeated knight. It looks less like the outcome of bloody combat and, and more like the transfer of an asset, a change in ownership. As if the army wasn't a collection of living, thinking individuals, but a resource that changed hands along with the surrender of its controller. Later in history, this strange role of the knight as the central element would be transformed. He would be replaced by a banner, a standard bearing a face, and as some sources indicate, even illuminated markers on poles. The loss of this symbol, like the loss of the knight, would mean complete defeat of the unit, albeit with less fatal consequences for personnel. But the replacement of a supposedly living commander with an inanimate object only emphasizes that his function was primarily symbolic and managerial rather than human. These bizarre, illogical laws of warfare paint a picture of the knight not as a person, but as a unique element, the center of a system governed by entirely different, non-human rules. If their existence on the battlefield was so regulated and isolated from ordinary people, what can we say about their daily lives? After all, if they fought so strangely, how did they live, especially during long military campaigns supposedly locked inside metal shells for weeks on end? Moving from battlefield oddities to the realities of campaign life, we encounter mysteries even more disturbing because they concern the basic requirements of biological survival. Historical accounts claim knights might not remove their armor for weeks at a time during campaigns or sieges. This fact, often presented as an example of incredible endurance, becomes an unsolvable problem the moment you think about it seriously. Imagine for a moment a person completely sealed inside a metal enclosure. The very first question that arises concerns basic physiology. How did someone trapped in such confinement relieve themselves? The answer found in some chronicles is simple and monstrous. Right there, inside the armor. This detail instantly shatters the entire romantic image. But the issue isn't aesthetics. It's fundamental biology. Under those steel plates, a knight wore padded garments, a gambeson or akiton. Anyone forced to exist under such conditions would turn their armor into a sealed container of human waste. Constant contact with bodily fluids would inevitably cause severe skin diseases, rashes, ulcers, and eventually blood poisoning. But it gets worse. Digging through archives, historians discovered information about an even more shocking hygiene practice supposedly used to cope with these conditions. The knight was periodically rinsed out. Water was poured inside the armor through the raised visor or neck opening several times daily. Some helmets, if you examine their design closely, appear specifically engineered for this purpose. They resemble funnels where the eye slit faces upward from the inside, convenient for pouring liquid in. Now let's assemble all the pieces of this puzzle. A person sealed in a metal space, wearing thick padded undergarments that are now constantly wet. This soaked cloth pressed against a body covered in its own filth. Under these conditions, even without engaging in combat, the human body would face catastrophic consequences. The constant moisture would lead to hypothermia even in moderate weather. Skin deprived of air and exposed to this aggressive environment would begin to decompose while the person was still alive. Any scratch or abrasion would instantly become a source of infection. How many days of such existence would it take before a person simply died from sepsis or pneumonia while sitting inside this wet, rotting cocoon? Weeks? More like days, if not hours. Add to this another legend often taken as metaphor for dedication. The knight slept standing up. What incredible willpower would be required to endure all the aforementioned torments while also depriving yourself of proper rest, human? Physiology demands muscle relaxation and horizontal positioning to recover strength and maintain circulation. Remaining constantly upright, especially in heavy armor, would cause swelling, vascular problems, and complete nervous system exhaustion. Endurance and willpower can accomplish much, but they cannot override the laws of biology. The combination of these factors, the unsanitary conditions, constant moisture, lack of proper sleep, creates a scenario where human survival seems absolutely impossible. This isn't merely discomfort. This is slow, agonizing death. Official history awkwardly attempts to explain these details, attributing everything to the harshness of the era and the phenomenal fortitude of medieval warriors. We're told about slaves who hauled stones for pyramids, so why not believe in knights who lived for weeks in wet armor? But what if the issue isn't superhuman endurance, but that we're starting from a false premise? What if this entire system was never designed for a fragile human body? What if the armor itself, its very construction, was the key to survival under these supposedly unthinkable conditions? Let's stop viewing the knight as a person and start examining his armor as engineers would. Perhaps the answers to all these questions are hidden in the metal itself, in its shape and design. When we study surviving suits of knightly armor, not as museum exhibits but as functional mechanisms, the number of questions multiplies exponentially. Instead of perfect protection tailored to a warrior's anatomy, we discover numerous design choices that seem not just inconvenient, but frankly incompatible with the human body. These engineering flaws appear so consistently that dismissing them as the incompetence of particular craftsmen becomes impossible. They appear to be systemic features, as if this armor was created from a template that didn't quite match human proportions. Let's start with what's most critical for any combatant: vision. A helmet must protect the head while allowing its wearer to see the enemy. Yet, on many medieval helmets, the eye slits are positioned in extremely odd locations. If you imagine placing an average human head inside, the person's eyes would be either significantly above or below these openings. To see anything, the warrior would need to hold his head in an unnaturally tilted position constantly. Fighting under these conditions, tracking an enemy's rapid movements while maintaining balance, would be nearly impossible. It's like trying to drive while looking at the road through a narrow mail slot positioned at the wrong height. One gets the feeling that a warrior in such a helmet couldn't navigate primarily by sight at all, as if he was receiving information through some other means. The mobility of limbs raises equally troubling questions. The foundation of any swordsmanship is freedom of arm movement, but the design of some plate pauldrons, the shoulder armor, completely contradicts this principle. The shoulder pieces are rigidly fixed to the breastplate without necessary articulation. Such rigid connection makes a full thrust or swing nearly impossible. The arm simply cannot extend forward for a stabbing attack. A warrior's movements in such armor would be stiff and limited, which in real combat equals suicide. The combat system built around such armor must have been completely different from any fencing techniques we understand. But the most astonishing mystery is hidden in the leg protection design. Many early examples of greaves covering the shins are single metal tubes that follow the shape of calf muscles and transition seamlessly into foot protection. They lack anything resembling a heel, and the boot portion curves directly into the foot covering. Most critically, these greaves have no openings, no hinges, no joints. They're solid, single pieces. Now, imagine a simple task. How does a person insert their foot, with its L-shaped ankle joint, through a narrow, solid tube? It's physically impossible to put on such armor. You'd either need to detach your own foot, possess impossibly thin and flexible legs, capable of bending at unnatural angles, or the armor would need to be several sizes too large, which would negate its entire protective function. Interestingly, later suits of armor featured hinged doors on the shin guards, closed with laces or primitive clasps. This seems like a solution, but the very fact that it wasn't there initially, and that the fastenings were extremely flimsy, suggests this was merely a later attempt to adapt alien technology for human use. And then there's the head. Like the one-piece greaves, early helmets also lacked opening visors. To don such a helmet, the head had to be pushed up from below through the neck opening. But here's the problem. This opening was often too narrow. Metal doesn't stretch like fabric. Trying to push a human head, with its maximum width at the ears, through a narrow metal ring is like trying to force your fist through the neck of a bottle. It simply won't work. All these design oddities, the eye slit placement, the rigid shoulders, the solid greaves, the narrow neck openings, they form a unified picture. It's as if this armor was never intended for a human being, as if it was created for an entity with different anatomy, with differently positioned eyes, different joint biomechanics, perhaps thinner and more flexible limbs, or even a differently shaped skull. These engineering flaws are too systematic to be coincidental. They force us to examine the armor from a completely different perspective. Especially strange in this context are the helmets themselves. They're not just faceless protection. Many are crafted as grotesque, terrifying masks. They look like faces. Inhuman, nightmare faces. When we examine medieval knight helmets closely, we enter territory where rational explanations begin to fail. If the primary function of armor is protection, then many helmets simply don't follow this logic. Instead of smooth, streamlined shapes designed to deflect blows, we often see true works of nightmarish art. Terrifying, grotesque, completely non-functional from a military standpoint. These aren't just helmets. They're metal faces frozen in hideous grimaces, with exaggerated features, bestial snarls, empty inhuman eye sockets. Official history explains this as psychological warfare, attempts to intimidate enemies. But in real battle where survival is at stake, a warrior would choose reliable, comfortable protection over decorative elements, no matter how frightening. Furthermore, the complex shapes, numerous protrusions, and detailed reliefs of such helmets would become perfect traps for enemy blades, increasing penetration risk rather than reducing it. A horizontal slit for a mouth on some examples? What purpose did that serve in combat? To shout insults or something else entirely? These helmets look less like devices for protecting a human face and more like replacements for one. A heretical thought emerges. What if these metal masks weren't imitating faces, but were the faces? What if they were integral parts of the creature inside, its true unchangeable physiognomy? This hypothesis gains support from other strange design elements. On many helmets near the ear areas, you can notice peculiar corrugated plates resembling small metal shells or dishes. Historians call them decorative mock ears. But why create such complex and vulnerable details purely for aesthetics? From an engineering perspective, such corrugated structures are perfectly suited for capturing and amplifying sound waves. They're strikingly similar to speaker diaphragms or primitive hearing aids. Perhaps these weren't decorations but vital sensory organs, allowing the being inside the armor to navigate by detecting sounds that a human ear, muffled by layers of metal and cloth, couldn't perceive. And such elements appeared not only on helmets. Beyond the strange acoustics, some helmets also featured peculiar hydraulic systems. As mentioned earlier, their construction often resembled funnels, as if specially adapted for something to be poured into them from above. In the context of rinsing the night with water, this seems part of a monstrous daily routine. But if we look more broadly, such design could have served to deliver nutrient mixtures or cooling fluids necessary to sustain the organism enclosed within this metal cocoon. This transforms the helmet from simple protective headgear into a complex interface connecting its wearer to the outside world through visual slits, acoustic membranes, and refueling ports. The helmet ceases to be just a mask. It becomes the central element of the system, its head in both literal and figurative senses. Its frightening appearance is not an attempt to scare human enemies, but possibly the true likeness of its owner, a reflection of its inhuman nature. These grotesque faces frozen in metal stare at us across the centuries, and their silence is more terrifying than any scream. They're the missing piece of the puzzle that's beginning to form a single, disturbing picture. So, we have illogical military rules seemingly not designed for humans. Living conditions inside armor that are absolutely lethal for people. Armor design that contradicts human anatomy. And finally, we're looking into the face of this mystery, the terrifying, inhuman masks of the helmets. Each thread, taken separately, seems like just a historical curiosity, but woven together, they form a pattern that has no place for the familiar image of the knight we've been taught to accept. If we assemble all these puzzle pieces, what image emerges? The legends and ancient engravings, once dismissed as mere artistic fantasy, give us the last and most terrifying clue. Now that all the pieces are before us, it's time to assemble them. The strange combat rules, the unbearable living conditions, the inhuman, armor design, the terrifying visages, they all point in one direction. But the final and most crucial element holding the entire structure together comes from ancient legends and imagery which official history has long dismissed as folklore and artistic exaggeration. What if they weren't metaphors but documentary evidence? In many cultures, tales exist of warriors who continue fighting even after decapitation. We usually interpret this as symbolic of incredible bravery and determination. But what if these descriptions should be taken literally? Legends tell us explicitly that a headless knight could remain active in battle for some time. This image finds gruesome confirmation in old engravings. We see scenes where a knight receives a blow that severs his head along with the helmet. Yet, this doesn't lead to immediate collapse. Moreover, the opponent's subsequent actions appear extremely strange. Instead of simply acknowledging victory, he begins performing manipulations that can hardly be called a finishing blow in the conventional sense. In some depictions, we see the victor, instead of striking the body, attempting to thrust his sword into the neck opening of the defeated armor. His actions resemble less an attempt to kill a person and more an effort to scoop out or damage something inside. It's similar to how one might clean a crab or shuck an oyster. It's a technical process, not an act of violence against a living being. Historians explain this as symbolic ritual or attempts to remove valuable armor, but in the chaos of battle, such actions seem absurd. It's far more logical to assume the removal of the head and helmet wasn't fatal. It merely disabled the primary control or sensory module, but the system inside the armor continued functioning. To finally shut it down, it was necessary to damage internal mechanisms through the only available opening. All these facts, from the illogical laws of war to the literal interpretation of legends, lead us to a single shocking hypothesis that explains absolutely every oddity. The knight's suit of armor was not armor as we understand it. It was something far more. It was an exoskeleton, a complex biomechanical system, possibly autonomous or semi-autonomous, serving either as an external shell and life support system for some biological creature, or it was the creature's body itself. Within this framework, everything falls into place. The inhuman living conditions were normal for an entity whose physiology differed from ours. The water rinsing could have been part of a cooling or feeding system. The inability to handle bodily functions in a human way wasn't problematic if the organism's metabolism was different, or the system had built-in waste processing. The inconvenient armor design was perfectly tailored to the anatomy of its true owner, not a human. The rigid shoulders and solid greaves weren't hindrances if the biomechanics of its limbs were different. The strange helmets with terrifying faces weren't masks, but the actual heads of these beings, equipped with specialized sensors. Most importantly, this theory explains the bizarre laws of warfare. The rule that only a knight may capture a knight wasn't about honor, but technical necessity. Only the operator of a similar system knew how to interact with it properly. The annihilation of an entire army after losing its knight was the shutdown of the control center, after which subordinate units, possibly human, became useless. And the legends of headless warriors ceased to be metaphors. If the head with helmet was just one module, albeit important, its loss didn't mean immediate shutdown of the entire system. We arrive at the conclusion that, beneath the guise of medieval knights, a non-human or post-human civilization may have been hiding, using complex exoskeletons to exist in our world. The people surrounding them, squires and soldiers, were more like maintenance personnel or subordinate units than equal comrades in arms. If this theory is correct, we face new, even more global questions. Where did these beings disappear? What happened to their technology? Why were they replaced by humans who clumsily copied their armor, turning functional elements into decoration? And why does official history so diligently sidestep all these facts, preferring to tell convenient tales of noble warriors instead of admitting there's a vast, terrifying, completely unexplored chapter in our past? This shocking theory, like a key, unlocks a door to a completely different version of history, leaving us alone with even deeper and more troubling questions. If the classical knights in their solid armor weren't human, but representatives of another civilization, then the entire subsequent history of knighthood is cast in new light. What do we see as we approach the Renaissance? The armor begins changing. Hinged doors on greaves appear, fastened with straps and laces. Neck openings become wider. Helmets are fitted with complex visor systems, allowing easy donning and removal. The quality of craftsmanship, despite external complexity, paradoxically declines. The seamless, precisely forged early suits are replaced by cruder composite constructions. Isn't this proof that humans, left without their masters, were simply trying to copy technology they didn't fully understand? They saw the external form, a metal suit, and tried to recreate it, adapting it to their own human anatomy. Where there was once a solid piece perfectly suited for a non-human limb, they now had to make cuts and invent lacing. Where there was a complex sensory helmet, there was now just a metal bucket with eye slits. Functional elements whose meaning was lost were transformed into useless decoration, into ornamental flourishes and heraldic symbols. The era of iron phantoms was replaced by an era of human imitation. Knighthood transformed from a phenomenon into a social institution, and the exoskeleton into ordinary armor. And then the question of legacy arises. Today, museums and armories worldwide hold colossal amounts of medieval weaponry. By some estimates, we're talking about tens of thousands of artifacts, over 3,800 breastplates, helmets, and shields, more than 2,200 bladed weapons, over 5,000 pole arms, thousands of firearms. We're told this is weaponry intended for soldiers of the 15th through 17th centuries. But what if a significant portion of this arsenal, especially the earliest and most perfect examples, isn't weaponry at all? What if these are the remains, the artifacts of an entire civilization we've overlooked? These aren't just pieces of metal. These are the skeletons, the shells of those who once walked this earth, fought on its battlefields, commanded its armies. We look at them in museums, admiring the skill of blacksmiths. But perhaps we're looking at the remains of the blacksmiths themselves, at their true form. All of this forces us to return to the beginning and ask the fundamental question: why does this version of history seem so incredible? Perhaps because official science prefers to ignore what doesn't fit the familiar worldview? It's easier to label an obvious design feature as ritual decoration than to admit we don't understand its purpose. It's easier to dismiss illogical historical facts as quaint customs of a harsh era than to allow the possibility that these customs weren't human. This position is convenient. It doesn't require revising thousands of dissertations and textbooks. It allows us to remain the sole intelligent masters of our planet and our history. But the facts are stubborn. They lie in museum display cases. They look out at us from pages of ancient manuscripts. They scream that our past may be far more complex, strange, and frightening than we're accustomed to thinking. We've been offered a beautiful, simple fairy tale about knights. But perhaps it's time to grow up and start asking uncomfortable questions. To look at armor not as costume, but as machinery. To read legends not as fiction, but as coded testimony. To seek answers not in ready-made explanations, but in those very anomalies that are so diligently ignored. Because perhaps within them, in these inconsistencies and impossibilities, the key to understanding who or what the Iron Knights of the Middle Ages truly were is hidden. History hasn't been fully written yet, and its most incredible chapters may still be waiting to be read.